The European Union and the UK are voicing concerns over media freedom in China. This after 2 European journalists were forced to leave the country. One of China's latest efforts to defend its actions in the Xinjiang region may have just backfired. A Xinjiang resident praising the internment camp seems to have been outed out as a fake. Shanghai is tightening up public control. Anyone who stays in the city for more than 24 hours must report to authorities. Worries escalate over the global supply chain of microchips. It is now extremely vulnerable as suppliers become more concentrated in certain regions, with Taiwan leading them. A possible crisis there could put the production of everyday necessities like smartphones, fridges, and microwaves at risk. And the Chinese regime is ramping up efforts to challenge the US dollar's dominance. But experts say that's not likely to happen anytime soon. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The European Union and the UK are voicing concerns over media freedom in China. This after a British and an Irish journalist were forced to leave the country last month. The BBC's China correspondent John Sudworth and his wife left China for Taiwan last week. His wife Yvonne Murray is the China correspondent for Irish broadcaster RTE. In a Friday statement, an EU spokesperson for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy says the EU calls upon China to abide by its obligations under national and international law and ensure the freedom of speech and press. She added that the EU has repeatedly expressed its concerns to Beijing over the undue working restrictions imposed on foreign journalists and reported related harassment. In February, Beijing announced that it would pull BBC World News off the air in China. That's due to the BBC's coverage of human rights abuses in the Xinjiang region. Last September, the Australian government helped 2 Australian journalists leave China. Beijing had previously tried to prevent them from leaving. One of China's latest efforts to defend its actions in the Xinjiang region may have just backfired. It came to a head when several Xinjiang residents spoke at a press conference earlier this week. The event was organized by the Chinese regime. During their remarks, the citizens praised the internment camps there. A number of Western countries accused China of using the camps to arbitrarily detain, torture, and brainwash 1 million Uyghurs, the name for members of a local ethnic minority. Many of those same countries have sanctioned Beijing officials over their involvement in the human rights abuse. And some, like the US, have designated what's happening there as genocide. Contrary to the calls from the West, the Xinjiang citizens speaking at the press conference claim they benefit from the training programs inside the camps. But one of them may have just been outed as a fake. Chinese media reported his name as Tahe Rijiang Toti. He claimed to have graduated from Hetian City Education and Training Center. During his speech, Toti expressed gratitude for the teachers in the camp, adding that they respect students' traditional customs and treat them like family. He says they taught him basic Chinese, legal knowledge, and vocational skills. Toti also thanked the teachers for what he described as removing his extreme religious thoughts. The appearance was not the first time that Toti was featured in Chinese state-run media, but last time he went by a different identity. The Chinese Communist Party's media mouthpiece Xinhua Net also reported on Toti last year. But back then, he was introduced as a successful restaurant owner in Xinjiang. In that video, Toti didn't mention any experience inside a so-called training center, nor did he attribute his success to vocational skills training. Instead, he claimed to have returned to his hometown to start a business after graduating from one of China's most renowned universities, Fudan University in Shanghai. It is commonly known that students who've graduated from such a university would have a mastery of the Chinese language. So why would he then need to learn basic Chinese at a training camp? Analysts suspect he is commissioned as a temporary actor by the Chinese regime in order to speak at the press conference. A document allegedly from authorities in Xinjiang is sparking discussion. The purported 2018 document appears to have been leaked and is now circulating online. It also features the official seal of the Communist Party. NTD cannot independently verify its source. The notice explains that a Uyghur woman from Qinghe County in the Xinjiang region was detained. That's because she was deemed unsafe by local authorities. The document seems to be from the Central Political and Legal Affairs Commission, one of the CCP's branch departments. It is located in the county where the woman lives. The notice lists the woman's name, home address, and other identifying information in detail under the reason of detention category. It says the woman was classified as among unsafe people with a potential to affect stability. The woman was reportedly detained for investigation. As a result, one netizen commented in reply, "The evil CCP feels everybody is unsafe." China's use of the term unsafe has also made BBC News reports last year. That says almost 90 people in Xinjiang were detained under that label. China's most populous megacity is tightening up public control. In Shanghai, anyone who stays in the city for more than 24 hours must report to authorities. Experts believe Shanghai is being used as a pilot city and that the measures may spread to other big cities. The new rule came into effect on Thursday. It covers all temporary visitors who come to the city for medical treatment, schooling, tourism, and business activities, plus any visiting relatives and friends of Shanghai citizens. But those entering the city on day trips under 24 hours don't have to report. Hotels and other accommodations must now register customers' personal data through a state-run website, following that customer's check-in. The regulations also require employers to report their temporary hires via a state-run site within 2 days. Those who fail to comply are fined up to $800. On Chinese social media platform Weibo, 160 million people read the announcement and related information. The new regulations have since triggered outcry and debate. One netizen accused the new rules of discrimination. He wrote, "People from other places visiting Shanghai now have to register and report. Why? We country folks have to be regarded as thieves when we visit the big city? This is obviously discriminatory and unfair." After complaints started pouring in online, Shanghai authorities issued a follow-up message. It claimed there had been a misunderstanding and added that the registration is voluntary. But some netizens question why people will be fined if they don't register if it's voluntary. Mr. Su is a legal professional from China. He believes it's inevitable that Chinese authorities will impose such strict control measures. He explains that because they want to control every detail of population flow. He notes that they'll likely extend it to other big cities like Beijing, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. CCP propaganda has turned many into party loyalists, but people working in the party system might not actually believe in the party as much as outsiders do. An insider tells his story. NTD's Xiu Huixu has more.
Surrounded by the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda, many in China have no choice but to buy into its narrative. But a former city-level official tells us that among Chinese authorities, fewer people now believe in it. Chun Shenjun worked as a regime official for over 20 years. Before fleeing the country, to protect his identity, we gave him a pseudonym.
I can't see hope. I can't see any hope for my next generation. China's economy has clearly declined since 2012. It's not as good as reported.
Chun explained the Communist Party controls people through fear, societal pressure, surveillance, and persecution. He also said that's why he left China, choosing to settle in the U.S. instead. His comments paint a different picture than the regime lets on. He says those who work as part of the Communist Party or its branch departments are becoming increasingly distrustful of Beijing's narrative. He used Hong Kong as an example, saying the regime has labeled Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters as thugs. But he pointed out that his friends, especially those in the public security system, don't believe in it.
Hong Kong protesters used glow sticks, mobile phones, and umbrellas. Then the CCP called them offensive weapons. We don't believe it. In particular, those working in the public security department don't believe it. They're closer to the core of the system and know more, so they're more distrustful of the CCP. They think that's absolutely ridiculous. It's just like saying a group of sheep attacked a group of lions. It's nonsense.
Chun believes the communist regime's primary tactic is to cultivate fear and use it to silence people. This has gradually become the norm, especially since the CCP virus first broke out in Wuhan last year. Chun says the second step is to force people to criticize and fight against each other. And the third step is to force people to enthusiastically support the regime. Those who aren't patriotic enough or who question Beijing's policies are purged. Chun also touched on China's so-called Little Pinks, a group of Chinese netizens who spread Beijing's narratives and strongly criticize anyone who voices contradicting opinions. Chun pointed out that those people are mostly outside the system. They're young and don't know what's really going on, so they're easily fooled by the regime. But he explained that officials who work inside the system have a clearer view of how the regime operates and do not follow it blindly. Chun said many officials in the system must be two-faced. On one hand, they have to meet the demands of their superiors and conform to the party's demands. On the other, they feel extremely dissatisfied with it. But Chun adds he doesn't want to live that way, nor does he want that for his child. Xu Xiuhui, NTD News.
7 of Hong Kong's leading pro-democracy advocates were convicted on Thursday for organizing a 2019 protest. They face up to 5 years in prison. The White House has condemned the action, calling it another example of Beijing's erosion of Hong Kong's freedom and of failing to live up to its international obligations. UN officials echoed the remarks, saying there should be no prisoners of conscience in the 21st century. U.S. Senator Rick Scott also chimed in, calling the conviction baseless. He says the Chinese regime is trying to wipe out the influence of pro-democracy leaders, and that Communist Party leader Xi Jinping is trying to ruin those who stand for liberty. An express train in Taiwan with almost 500 people on board derailed in a tunnel today. At least 50 passengers died and nearly 150 were injured. It's the island's worst rail disaster since 1948.
A train in Taiwan has derailed inside a tunnel, killing dozens of people. Around 70 passengers are still trapped, and 40 others have been taken to hospital in what is Taiwan's worst rail disaster in at least 4 decades. The train had been travelling from Taipei to Taitung when it apparently hit a truck and came off the rails north of Hualien. Images of the crash scene show carriages inside the tunnel ripped apart from the impact. Taiwan's fire department said there had been some 350 people on board the train. Many of them were reported to have been standing because it was so full. More than 80 people have been evacuated from the first 4 carriages, but the others are harder to reach. The accident happened at the start of the long weekend for the traditional Tomb Sweeping Day. The last major train derailment in Taiwan was in 2018, which left 18 people dead.
A new study says the global semiconductor supply chain is extremely vulnerable to disruptions. That's because it isn't spread out enough. Taiwan is a main producer, but conflicts in the region could affect chip supplies. NTD Sapphire Quarter reports.
A new industry study says the global semiconductor supply chain has become more and more vulnerable because suppliers have become more concentrated in certain regions. For example, manufacturing of the most advanced chips is completely located in Asia, mostly in Taiwan.
If there were to be some sort of disruption again in East Asia, for whatever reason, that the United States might not be able to get the chips that it needs for a lot of its not just daily goods, but potentially, defense needs as well.
The report found if Taiwan were unable to make chips for a year, it would cost the global electronics industry almost $500 billion in revenue. The president of the U.S.-Taiwan Business Council says there's nothing we can do about it in the short term.
In the longer term, however, there's strong geopolitical currents to diversify high-end manufacturing, so there's more of a balance on either side of the Pacific.
These chips are a wonder of innovation and design that power so much of our country, enables so much of our modern lives.
The U.S. government is working on it. Congress has introduced a bill called the CHIPS Act to encourage investment in chip manufacturing and research in the United States. And Biden is proposing $50 billion for semiconductor manufacturing and research. They don't want the U.S. to be dependent when it comes to key technologies.
What if the Chinese were to block Taiwan and sever Taiwan's ability to export its products, including semiconductors? We'd be seeing significant disruptions.
Walters says semiconductors are very important.
As our electronic goods become more interconnected, as we develop faster TVs and smartphones and more connected automobiles and things like that, the demand for chips is going to continue to increase.
Intel, TSMC, and Samsung are planning 4 factories in the U.S. Meanwhile, China is giving out subsidies to its chip industry as it tries to reduce its dependence on the West. Sapphire Quarter, NTD News.
The world's top chip makers are spending big to tackle a global shortage of semiconductors. Just days after U.S. giant Intel announced a $20 billion investment, Taiwan's TSMC announces an even bigger plan. It's investing $100 billion over 3 years to boost output at its plants. The firm is the world's largest contract chip manufacturer, supplying brands like Apple. Its new investment comes as firms around the world reel from a lack of silicon. Pandemic disruption, strong demand for consumer electronics, and U.S.-China trade tensions are among the factors. The shortage has forced car makers to cut output and is now biting makers of phones, laptops, and even home appliances like fridges. TSMC says this is a good time to invest. Besides the current shortage, it says factors like the shift to 5G phone networks should ensure that demand stays strong. TSMC shares rose around 2.5% on Thursday following the news. Tesla posted record results on Friday for the first quarter. It delivered nearly 185,000 vehicles globally. Refinitiv said that's about 7,000 more than expected. Its less expensive models drove the sales, offsetting the impact of a global shortage of parts. Tesla's latest numbers are over 100% higher than the same time last year, but it's only 2% higher than the previous quarter, which was its previous record. One analyst expects Tesla's sales to exceed 850,000 vehicles this year. The Chinese regime is ramping up efforts to challenge the dominance of the U.S. dollar. But is it going to be successful in the near future? NTD's Penny Zhou has more.
Despite its efforts, the Chinese regime is less likely to challenge the U.S. dollar's dominance, at least anytime soon. That's according to a new report from Taiwan's central bank. It says that's because the regime lacks key conditions. They are needed to make the Chinese yuan a global currency like the dollar. But the regime is holding out hope, now focusing on the introduction of its digital currency. The virtual money is issued by its central bank and is already in pilot use in several Chinese cities. For now, China is leading the world in the digital currency race. Last year, a Chinese professor claimed that digital currency is enough of a game changer to eventually make the Chinese yuan a global currency. But Taiwan's central bank argues that 3 factors are holding China back from achieving that goal. The first is its strict capital control. Beijing keeps tight controls over money moving in and out of China. Large overseas money transfers and foreign exchange purchases are all subject to scrutiny. These policies aren't likely to fundamentally change.
Not to mention enterprises and companies, even for an individual. If your transaction is over tens of thousands of yuan, it is subject to immediate control. So the yuan now has 2 dead knots. One is circulation, and the other is exchange. If these 2 knots are not untied, the talks of yuan internationalization are just empty words.
The second issue Chinese yuan face is public confidence.
The yuan needs to be used more in trade for it to be internationalized. If you want to expand its use, you have to gain trust. People need to trust the currency.
But China's domestic debt crisis, lack of transparency in its legal system, and data privacy concerns all raises question about its trustworthiness. The third factor is whether the Chinese yuan can become more attractive than the U.S. dollar. So far, China accounts for about 1/5 of global GDP, but the Chinese yuan represents only about 2% of the world's currency reserves, while the U.S. takes up over 2/3 of it. Though China still has a long way to go, it is actively taking first steps in Asia to promote its digital currency. Late last year, Hong Kong's monetary authority announced it will test the use of digital yuan for cross-border payments. Also last year, Singapore said it was discussing ways to work with the Chinese central bank on digital currency. The Asian finance hub has shown willingness to build strategic economic partnerships with China. That includes helping promote yuan internationalization. Chinese officials and researchers have also suggested promoting its digital currency and the yuan through its Belt and Road Initiative via its partner countries. Penny Zhou, NTD News.
U.S. Senator Rick Scott is encouraging Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison to join an effort to move the 2022 Winter Olympics out of China. This is in response to Beijing's dismal human rights record. Morrison has been known for his tough stance against Beijing when addressing its human rights record. Scott has also called for an investigation into the origins of the CCP virus. The Chinese regime is largely believed to have covered up the outbreak in the early stages. Amid territorial disputes in the South China Sea, the Philippines says it has found illegal constructions in an exclusive economic zone. The man-made structures are close to where Chinese vessels visited recently. The South China Sea has been stricken with tension due to the Chinese regime's sweeping territorial assertions. Although international courts have deemed the regime's claims unlawful, Beijing seems to be undeterred. The Philippines discovered the structures during a military patrol flight on Tuesday. It's located on a reef called the Union Banks in the Spratly Islands. On Thursday, the Philippines reported a swarm of more than 250 Chinese vessels near the area. The Filipino military chief did not say anything about who built the structures or the details of the construction. But Beijing does have a record of building artificial structures to assert its territorial claims in the South China Sea. The Filipino military chief says the recent constructions are prejudicial to peace, good order, and security of our territorial waters. Last Sunday, the U.S. Secretary of State called out Beijing's aggression. He also reaffirmed support for the Philippines, a U.S. ally. It is unclear if the Filipino side actually knows who built the structures. But the Filipino president does have a record of yielding to Beijing's pressure. He has previously said that if CCP leader Xi Jinping trespasses on Filipino waters, he would not be able to stop him. China, Russia, Iran, and Europe are meeting for talks over the Iran nuclear agreement. That's over a possible U.S. return to the deal. The agreement is formally known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. It's an agreement reached between several countries to curb Iran's nuclear development. Under the terms, Iran agreed to dismantle its nuclear program in exchange for an easing of international sanctions on the country. In 2018, then-President Trump left the agreement and reinstated sanctions on Iran. Trump said the country was not fulfilling its responsibilities under the agreement. The restoration of U.S. sanctions on Iran devastated its economy. A possible U.S. return to JCPOA would mean those sanctions would be lifted. China, Iran's ally, says it welcomes the move. On Friday, China's foreign ministry said authorities will discuss the roadmap for the U.S. and Iran and bring the deal back to the right track. The U.S. seems to agree. State Department spokesman Ned Price welcomed the discussions as a positive step. He says Washington has been clear for weeks now that the U.S. is ready to return to the JCPOA. The meeting on Friday will detail the possible U.S. return and how to ensure the deal is implemented. The national security advisors of the U.S., Japan, and South Korea will have a three-way talk today. An expert tells us what this meeting may mean.
On Friday, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan will meet his counterparts from Japan and South Korea for a trilateral dialogue in Washington. It will be the first of these three-way talks under the Biden administration. The White House says they will consult on a wide range of regional issues and priorities, including maintaining peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. Some experts see this as a good move.
It allows the three countries to coordinate policies and also sends a public message of that the U.S. is conferring with its allies, showing the importance of alliances.
A UN report released on Wednesday says North Korea continued cyber attacks to fund its nuclear and missile programs. The virtual assets stolen by the regime between 2019 and late 2020 are reportedly worth more than $300 million U.S.
Many people don't realize that such a seemingly backward technologically country as North Korea has a very good cyber attack capability, top 3 or 4 in the world.
Klinger assumes that North Korea will conduct major provocative tests this year, as they did with every new U.S. administration. And he expects the Biden administration's response will be a continuation of what U.S. policy has been with North Korea for decades, a combination of putting pressure on the regime and opening up dialogue and offering benefits.
And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you soon.